Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Social Z Franchise Happy Hour podcast. I'm the host, as usual, Calvin Smith, coming from a very hot and muggy Destin, Florida. It's busy here, a lot of tourists. Everyone's out at Crab Island having a great time. But I'm excited to get to talk to our next guest, Mr. Doug Harvey, coming from, is it Monroe, Louisiana, Doug?
Monroe, Louisiana.
Monroe, Louisiana. So I don't know if you know this. I was looking and doing a little research. Monroe was once called the Prairie of the Canoes. Did you know that?
I did not know that. There's a lot of things associated with us in the water, but I have not heard of that one.
Yeah, I guess it was renamed to Monroe in 1819. So we learned some Monroe trivia today. But thanks so much for joining us, Doug. We're so excited to talk to you. You're a extremely busy man. You've got at least four full-time things going on, it seems like. So we want to dive right into it. But to kick us off, if you could just tell us, anything that you feel like is interesting and about yourself as far as background goes, and then also tell us what you're doing for personal development right now. Are you reading something? You're working on some sort of exercise program? What are you doing to improve Doug?
Yeah, so to just hop right in, so I live here in Monroe, Louisiana, as we've previously discussed. I'm married, have 5 children with a blended family.
Oh,
Uh,
goodness.
it's a big group here at the house, and they're spread across ages from 19 to 10.
Oh, wow.
So it's definitely a pretty good spectrum there. So yeah, the things that we generally talk about is, like, hey, I am a franchise owner. I've been a franchise owner for going on about 18 months now with the UPS
Mhm.
store franchisee. Also, I have a day job where I'm a senior executive for a manufacturing company for woody biomass. So that's a version of green energy that you see out and about in the world. I also have a long-term rental portfolio that I'm not as active in managing anymore. I essentially go and I'll still find pieces and ultimately throw those in there. And I've got great property managers that support me in that role. I also have a city council role. So a couple of years ago, back in 2019, I somehow decided that was a great idea, that this was an opportunity for me to support my community because I had no political aspirations. It was just one of those things where I was trying to figure out who I should support, and the next thing I knew, it was me. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, so that kind of talks about like the things that are taking up most of my time when you think about like, hey, what's the day-to-day routines and
Wow.
tasks and stuff like that. So yes, like, hey, what am I doing as far as like personal development and really just stuff that's unique? I mean, the stuff that's really unique is just I just what the development too is just I consider myself on this continuous journey to uh, try to get better, but it's not like it's broken or anything like that. But it's this journey that's really fun to be on as you continue to. And I've had to obviously like a lot of really cool stuff over time. I've mountain biked in Bolivia. I've done all these
Wow.
hiking trips, and I think I'm 19-ish countries now that I've been to, and
Wow.
I had a really traumatic car crash back in November, and I'm here. This is my left arm. I was impaled and open fracture, just all kinds of craziness. But I'm
Oh, my
I'm
goodness.
going to get to go climb Mount Rainier in July. So I mean, 8 9 months removed from that, and I'm going to be able to do those kind of projects, or and something to work toward. The stuff that
Yeah.
I'm really focused on is, how do I ultimately, a lot of us follow the longevity space, and ultimately what are the things that I can do to make it where not necessarily I live to be 200 years old, but how do I make it to where I feel like I'm still maybe 40 years old when I'm 80 years old, and really just
Sure.
prolong my health span. And I
Mhm.
follow that space a lot. I'm reading a lot about that piece, and I'm also reading this book I'm reading right now is, essentially it's Die with Zero, and it's really talking about how you make the most of experiences and what you're truly doing in all these different pursuits I'm talking about. And 3 of those are in versions of making money, but when should I spend it? When does it matter? And it's not this just accumulation game that it's it's probably uh, is for others to some extent,
Mhm.
because you got to realize what you're actually doing it for. It's not just
Yeah.
a scoreboard. So yeah, that's the one
Yeah.
I'm on right now.
Man, that's awesome. You've got a lot going on, Doug. You are a busy man. I knew you had the city council, the investments, the franchise, and obviously a great career. But you mentioned you had 5 kids. That's a job and a half, right? So,
For sure.
um, that's amazing. So, want to dive into a lot of this, but let's take a step back if we can, Tell us about, your story to how you got here. Did you grow up in Louisiana? What was your childhood like, your education, and what were some of the key things that you felt are important to get you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be raised with my grandparents. My
Wow.
parents had kind of divorced when I was young, and they each had their challenges. And my grandparents raised me, and it was one of those opportunities to really be blue collar and really develop I feel like I developed my work ethic in that stage of
Mhm.
life. Part of it was because we still lived on a farm and my grandparents were in their 60s and that was hard work. And some of that was just enough motivation that like I've got to figure out how to not work in fields and stuff like that.
Mhm. Yep.
And I was fortunate enough to also just be really blessed with people that were willing to invest in me. I
Mhm.
had so many people along my early development, my career, that ultimately were giving a part of me, part of themselves to me and making me better. So, like, I was a guy who, all the way through college, I worked at a manufacturing plant. I was like the only guy I knew that took a pay cut when they graduated because I was working 70 hours a week manufacturing, and all of a sudden you're going to a salary job, and it's like, this is how college is supposed to work. And
Mhm.
but yeah, it was definitely. Sometimes you go and do these things and you start just and you work this hard or you go on this path and you just kind of do it because you don't know any different. Like there's no world now where I would advise my kid, who's my oldest is in college right now, and I remember I would go to the plant and get off at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, well, I got a 7 o'clock class, so I'm gonna go.
Oh
I'm just gonna
man.
crash in the parking lot, and then I'll do my class in the morning. Then I'll go home, and then I'll come back to work this afternoon. And I would never advise my child to do something like that, but it's formative, and I'm just
Sure.
really blessed to be where I am. And it goes back to like, hey, I've just had a bunch of people that were willing to invest in me and teach me different things. I had a
Mhm.
machinist I worked with at that first plant, and he was the guy who really got me into rental properties, and he showed me the way, and he was doing it, and he. It's also around that same time. I'm pretty sure he's the guy who handed me the copy of Rich Dad Poor Dad that really
Sure.
influenced a lot of us, and I have
Yeah.
stories of people like that all along the way who've just been really good to me.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's great. And obviously that we could talk for a long time, Doug, I'm sure about a lot of this stuff. But what I'd like to kind of focus on now, if we can, is, you mentioned, you worked your way through school at Louisiana Tech. Obviously, built yourself a great career in the space that you're in. You mentioned that you got into your real estate investing pretty early on in that, and you've kind of grown that portfolio. And before we dive into some other things, how have you balanced? Let's just start there. It sounds like because you started early. What was your balance early on of, hey, I'm building my career, but I'm also building some investments, and you know how how did that kind of influence you eventually buying a franchise?
Yeah, so when I first did it, I was, in fairness, I got a little burnt out. I figured out how hard to how you can work too hard, and then all of a sudden
Sure.
I remember the Zig Ziglar analogy where like, hey, you got all these different gardens of life, and they're like a spoke on a wagon wheel. And so it's like your finances, your career, your family, and it's like if one of those spokes is damaged, you can get by. But if you are only focused on your career, for example, and then let's say whatever happens, you don't work at that job anymore, and you've got identity tied to that, then all of a sudden that wheel will not turn. And
Hmm.
I flirted with versions of that early on, put a
Sure.
lot of identity into that, and it forced me to really just kind of take a step back and reevaluate. And so that's when I started just kind of dabbling with my entrepreneurial side. I mean, it was my
Hmm.
grandfather was an entrepreneur, and he was just really instrumental. And my, of course, my grandfather's still around too, so I don't want to use the past tense too much, but that was definitely the lessons he was teaching me at the time were
Hmm.
really instrumental that I had to carry forward. But I also, during all of that, was I just really I took a step back. That's when I really went into that personal development and looking at what should how do I become the more balanced version of me? How do I make sure that whenever um, I'm focusing on my health at the same time, and I have like this addictive personality, so I either go all in on something or I don't do
Yeah.
it. And so like I went to like I wasn't managing my weight real well, so I went from you know running a 5K in June or July because I didn't know how long the distance was until the day before, and then I ran a marathon 6 months later.
Oh
Uh,
well. Yeah.
so I I did a handful of things like that, and as I had a small business that we had that was doing like the race timing, like for those 5Ks, for example. You
Sure.
have your chip or your bib. Now the bibs are kind of like your chip version, and they got the little tag on them. And we had some software we were using, some RFID chips, and we started doing that. And so that was successful. I enjoyed it, but then I realized at some point that like I was as my kids started doing soccer and cheer and things like that, then all of a sudden I was trading time from to away from them to go and make a little bit of money here. So
Hmm.
it was actually enough to really, cause me to exit that and really, uh, really take um, stake of what everything was there. Like, okay, this is a trade that doesn't make sense for me anymore.
Sure.
So I've had a couple of opportunities that look like that, and for me, like the way that I stay balanced, and you know, my I had a boss one time that said, with enough planning, Doug can be spontaneous, which was really just saying that Doug was very rigid, and which was absolutely true, and there's still a lot of that that's true today, and
Sure.
so, but I built in this free space for me to do my stuff. Like every Saturday I have belongs to either one of the kids or my wife. I mean, unless I have something randomly going on, then you know, last Saturday was Caitlin's. It was Caitlin's birthday. This Saturday's Connor's. We did something with Abby like 2 Saturdays ago, and that's just I have to carve that stuff out. I mean, I do it just. I work with coaches. My coach. We were talking about like I said, man, I wanted to make sure I do something every week, and I was kind of doing it. And he's like, Doug, he said, you're a planner. He said, lean into what you're good at. He said, go do it 3 months out. He said, just figure out what you're gonna do for the next 3 months. Put the spot on the calendar, and you also don't have to plan everything. You can let them plan it. Really just how do I do it versus how am I challenged in doing it. So I know there's seasons. There's seasons that are more career focused. There's seasons that are a little more health focused, and you're always trying to. I tell people like it's not so much about balance the noun. It's balancing the verb. I mean
Yeah.
it's an ongoing exercise, and I'm definitely doing that. But I carve out time every Sunday, and I just figure out like, okay, what do the next 7 to 14 days look like? And how am I going to ultimately try to water all of these different gardens in my life? So
Yeah.
probably 8 years into that process, and where I've really just been committed to figuring those things out, and they've been fruitful for me.
Yeah. Doug, it seems like you're very in tune to kind of introspection and as busy as you are, it sounds like you do take time to work on yourself as you mentioned. You know, what has been your process to put that into part of your life? I mean, was there something that, you mentioned you had an accident recently, but was there something that just clicked with you and you said, "Hey, I've got to devote time to this"? And then, how did you go about it? Or was it just gradually over time you started developing, new systems like,
A lot of it was reading and taking somebody's system, and that became this very iterative process that you know there's the beauty of compounding. So if I'm a little bit better at it each day, I'll be so far down the road 5 years from now. I can tell you that and I spoke on this recently, that I can draw a line on the sand on the day that I really started investing in myself and throwing real money behind it. And also at the same time, getting around people that were thinking the same way. You get around people like yourself who are on similar journeys, and getting around those types of people versus the people that you have close to you. And they're not usually the same. I mean, if you're one in a million and you live in Louisiana, there are at least four more in Louisiana like you. So you've got to find those four and figure out where you can do those
hmm
kind of things. I mean, but it's there's a real line in the sand. Like, hey, when my trajectory changed when I started doing that, and so I'm in a mastermind. I'm a member of Abundance. There's a couple different groups that I'm part of, and I've popped in and out of some over the years. It's okay to say that this one doesn't make sense for me right now, or maybe it made sense for a season of my life, and you
hmm
just got to figure out if people in you're in the room with are making you better, and
hmm
for the people that I'm in the groups with, they're not so much trying to help me make money or things like that. Which there's plenty of groups that are doing that, but I have groups that are helping me focus on. Uh, we challenge each other on our relationship goals, on our what we're doing with our health. When there's all those different pieces and focusing on your whole life, and that's been really instrumental to me is whenever I've changed the groups that I was spending time with and finding people that were aligned with similar strategies to what I'm trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. That's great. And we all could do a lot more of that. So it sounds like with everything that you've got going on from, personal development to running marathons to climbing mountains, man, that's awesome that you're able to balance all that. Tell us a little bit about how you got into the city council role. You mentioned that it wasn't something you really planned on, and how did that come about, and how does that fit into this whole puzzle that is Doug Harvey?
Well, I remember reading one time, and and I'll say like when I was a lot younger, probably 10 years ago. You'd watch the news, and it's like, hey, this is garbage in, garbage out. I don't really want to intertwine with this, and I found that was really mostly true of national politics. And even though sometimes I'm lobbying for my local projects at federal level, I do that once a year. But it was like that didn't appeal to me. That still to this day does not appeal to me. But somebody told me, I said, if you really want to understand how politics affect you, look at your local and state level. And so that's what I was doing. And so I met my city councilman who was running for a state rep seat, and we had looked at some projects together because he's looking at manufacturing. He's trying to figure out how to support that. I've been very present in that space most of my career and built a relationship and really just start paying attention to that piece because we all focus on national level politics, but if you really want to change your life, focus on local and state. And you can have an impact too. That's the real thing, especially your local level. It doesn't have to be political. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we can all get plugged into our communities because whenever that position became open for city council, I was also going through a local leadership program at the time. I probably wouldn't have had those two events tied at the same time, an election cycle and going through this leadership area. This leadership was kind of like tied to our parishes, which is a county anywhere else. Louisiana has parishes versus counties,
Sure.
and I started just kind of seeing the different moving parts. I could see the anatomy and the mechanics of how local government was working. And so it's around the same time this position came open. And I was sort of thinking, like, well, who can I help? Who can I support in this journey? Like, hey, who can I figure out a way to get into this office that's ultimately going to reflect my views and just help want to do the same things I'm trying to do? And when I started asking around, to make this long story short, the people I talked to ultimately said that should be you. And it didn't make sense at first, but after a while, I was kind of on the fence, and then a friend of mine was like, "Look, you said you just do it or don't do it." He said, "You're talking about it too much. You're going to end up doing it, so just do it. Get off the fence." And so I did that. Going into a pandemic. I went in like in February of 20, and it was
Oh
a
my goodness.
challenging time. Not only that pandemic, we had a tornado go through a major part of the city on Easter Sunday that year, so that was like a month into the pandemic of stay at home and that kind of stuff. And then we had a hurricane, and it was the strongest hurricane that ever made it that far north into Louisiana. So we had that in August. So we had like a year of just natural disasters. And
Oh man.
for somebody that just likes to get out there and work and cut trees out of houses and things like that, that's easy for me. The stuff that's hard is trying to figure out how to you make people happy, but balance people's concerns and do it in a way that you're at least getting most people where they feel like they're pleased with the work you're doing. But it's been
Sure.
something that I found that I believe that I'm good at this stage and of finding good solutions. We're definitely in a world where we have challenging inflation, so all of our infrastructure projects are. And that's why I tell people, like, when you're local government, you're almost a representative for a utility because a lot of your cities they own so much of your utilities, and that's a real version of that too. So you become like the customer service side, but the things you're also trying to solve are like, okay, every city that's probably my size, 50,000, they each have their own aging infrastructure problems and things like that. So I put the engineering hat on, like, okay, how do we solve this? How do we find practical solutions? How do we figure out how to land? What's the difference between why this city landed a major economic development project and we didn't? And
Sure.
solving those kind of problems. I tell people that working on somebody's garbage not being picked up is the price of admission to get to work on those kind of projects.
Right.
The one where you plant the seed today for shade that you may not ever get to enjoy.
Yeah. And that's great. It sounds like more than just the, you know, some of the things that people think about when they think about city council. You're able to find a little bit of purpose in there too. That's great, Doug. So we couldn't get through a full episode here if we didn't talk about your franchise. So obviously you didn't have enough to do. So at some point in 2021, you decided to buy a franchise. So talk to us about that decision process and what the journey was and why you ended up on buying a UPS store.
Yeah. So I was, I had this plan of like, hey, I'm gonna buy a property or two every year, and that's just how I'm gonna hopefully grow my wealth and get myself to a different station in life. And you start hanging around with people who buy one or two houses, one house a year, and that's kind of what you'll do. If you get around people that buy 10 houses a year, that's you'll start to figure out ways to do the things that they're doing because buying 10 houses a year is not 10 times harder than buying one house a year. But
Sure.
what I did though is I said, hey, I'm in that version of where I'm starting to get around people in these different groups and really shifting there. I'd become a little bit, I won't say disillusioned with long-term real estate, but I just watched the COVID moratorium, eviction moratorium happen. And whether you believe that was right or wrong, that's not really the key thing. The key thing that really stood out to me is like there's a world where somebody can just literally cut off my revenue off with a one fell swoop. So I was like, okay, this is not as diversified as I would like. And I was also thinking about, I'd had a small business before, I'd done some other ventures before, but it was like, how can I take the systems approach that I take to manufacturing and turn that into a business? And
Mhm.
I still wanted to continue to do what I was doing with my manufacturing work, and I wanted to figure out a way to kind of say, hey, what can I lay a system on top of? And so franchises were the thing that just really made sense to me. And
Sure.
as I was looking at, I said, well, hey, let's see, the new ones have such a startup curve and feed it cash for a while. So I said, I'm going to look for something existing. And
Mhm.
sure enough, there was a UPS store, not the one closest to me, but the one probably 15 minutes away from me was for sale. And if you look at like, I remember thinking like just for sake of round numbers, I mean, I paid 330, 340 for my franchise, and it was making 100 grand a year pre-debt. So I can't buy a $330,000 property that does the same thing. That being said,
Sure.
I have to work on it a little more actively and those kind of things too. But even if I was active every day with that property, I wouldn't make that kind of investment. So I mean, the multiples really made sense, and it was quite a journey because the gentleman that owned it had developed long-term debilitating disease, and he actually passed away before we
Oh
completed
my
the
goodness.
transactions. So
Oh
we went through
wow.
probate, we went through all kinds of stuff, just trying to get that across the line. And it was, finally in December of 21, finally closed on it. And so we've been there 18 months now. You spend the first 6 months figuring out what you don't know, and then after that, you get to be a little more proactive and figure out how to try to grow the business. And I've been fortunate enough to have there was a pretty strong team that was there, that was in place. Just there definitely have felt some pain of the transition from whenever there because he was a very active owner, and so
Sure.
whenever he passed, and for a few months before that happened, he wasn't active in the store. So there was definitely like this lull that you're trying to come out of as you would have as an void of leadership. So yeah, it's been really fun though. I mean, the reason I picked a UPS store, and it's just kind of random, I liked my UPS store. And it was like, well, if I like mine, and then surely this will make sense. And
Yeah.
the UPS store franchise is a really interesting one because you think of it as like packaging, shipping, and I'm using my UPS store originally because it was the opportunity to have a physical address as like a mailbox. So if you use
Right.
your PO box, you can't register it to an LLC as a physical address, but you can with a UPS store address. That was my
Okay.
initial draw. And so, but the other side of that, the fourth layer to it is the printing. So when and it's kind of like, hey, getting around people that are winning and trying to figure out their recipe for success. And ultimately, the UPS stores that are really successful are print places that happen to be UPS stores. And
Okay.
versus a UPS store that happens to do printing. And those guys that have
Mhm.
been franchisees in the last 4 or 5 years, and those guys kind of came in with printing versus like an existing owner that I had who they just kind of added on. It was one more thing to do. And so we just invested
Sure.
in it differently, and you can see the stores that are incredibly successful. That's what they look like. So
Mhm.
that's kind of the roadmap we're following, and it's fun. It's we like it. We want more. We have to be 1 year brand compliance. We had to do a little bit of remodel and stuff whenever we bought the store just to kind of get it back up. But like in Q3, early Q3, we should be eligible for our second franchise with that network.
Awesome.
So we're looking forward to that. There's a new build that we're evaluating that we want to be a part of.
Yeah, that's great. That's exciting, Doug. Thanks for sharing that journey. Um, I do want to be respectful of your time, but last thing I want to get from you is, what is the next go? So you've got the mountain climb coming up, obviously, which is a big deal. You're going to buy another franchise in Q3. Besides that, like with hopefully we get to talk to you this time next year. What if we get to have that conversation? What is something that you hope you've accomplished or that you would make you feel successful during that time?
Yeah, we're going to finish construction on a new house. We're 13, 14 months into a 12-month project, but we'll finish that in the Q3. That's one of our big goals for the year, to get that across the line and get it finished. Climb Rainier, have our second location. Uh, that's like the big three that we have for the year. Wife and I are going to do a trip away in the fall, probably in southeastern Spain on the coast there, see some
Wow.
friends. We're going to continue to, I can tell you about my goals. I mean, we want one weekend a month where we go visit my grandparents. We still want to have the one-on-one time with the kids at least every other week. And I mean, those are our goals. We got a fishing trip that we're wanting to do with the kids in the fall. So if I say, hey, I've done those things, then I'll have lived a very full 2023.
Absolutely. Man, that's great. That's great. Doug, I promise this is the last question. What do your grandparents think about your journey? You mentioned your grandfather, being an influence and being an entrepreneur. Like, what are their comments on where you are?
Well, they're extremely proud of me. I mean, they want me to save any newspaper clipping that has any mention of my name. If we happen to make the news for council stuff, they want to know what channel it's going to be on, kind of thing. And you never want to make the news as council, but sometimes it's like, hey, there's a report on something, or we have like a state of the city address that we do in first weekend of May every year. So told them about that so they could watch it. No, they're incredibly proud.
Absolutely.
They invested a lot in me, and I worked in paper mills and stuff, and my grandfather, he used to tell me like, hey, if you work really hard and do all this stuff, you won't have to do this manufacturing job that he did for the first part of his career. And then I went and just did a different version of working in manufacturing. But that being said, he still couldn't be prouder of that side too.
Yeah. Well, that's great, man. I'm sure they're very proud of you. Well, Doug, thank you so much for taking some time to join us and let us hear your story. Very inspiring, and I think most people are going to get something out of this and feel motivated and probably wonder when you actually sleep. But we're glad to get to talk to you, and we hope we get to talk to you this time next year. For anyone that's listened to Doug's story, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast here. I hope you join us next time. And Doug, to wrap us up, close this out, we'll ask you to give us your elevator pitch on your UPS store.
Yeah, so our primary customers is a small business. So we put the mailbox where you can have a place for everything to come when you're not at home. And if you're shipping out products, we want to be a part of that. Your Amazon returns and then your printing. Everybody has a version of printing work that they're doing. What's a brochure that shows like, hey, here's what our products are, or you're wanting to get this booklet out and get some laminating done. You want shredding done. I mean, it's really a small business resource for definitely for that small company, kind of like that 5 to 10 and person group, and that's where a lot of businesses in the United States look like. And so ultimately, that's who we're trying to serve. And I'll just add that if I can help anybody or anything like that, you can just send me an email. It's Doug@DouglasHarvey.com, and I read them all, and I'll reply back and see how I can help.
Awesome. Doug, thanks again, man.